Hello, everybody. My name is Barbara Gödecke, and I'm one of the Language Center specialists in autonomous language learning here at the University of Padua. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the final event of this academic year's edition of 9 Months, 9 Universities, the series of online lectures organized within the framework of Working Group 11 of the Arqus European University Alliance. The Arqus Alliance brings together 9 universities who share academic, scientific, and cultural objectives, a common vision of the role of higher education and research, and mutual fields of interest. Together, the partner universities are building an innovative and inclusive approach to education, research, and innovation. Working Group 11 is the plurilingual and intercultural hub of the Alliance, and its aim is to promote plurilingualism and foster intercultural competences amongst the Alliance's member universities. The 9 Months, 9 University webinar series is designed to generate awareness and appreciation for multilingualism and interculturalism, and to explore the many areas of our lives that are influenced by and connected to language. The webinars cover specific language and culture-related topics and are primarily aimed at graduate and postgraduate students, early-stage researchers, and staff members who wish to explore these subjects further. Let me now introduce you to today's speaker from the University of Leipzig, Antje Quick. Professor Quick is a senior research associate in English studies at Leipzig University. She holds a PhD in English linguistics from the University of Leipzig and completed her habilitation at the Friedrich-Alexander-Universität in Erlangen in 2023. Her research focuses on multilingual first language acquisition and language contact, phenomena from a usage-based perspective. It pays particular attention to lexically specific patterns and their role in the development of syntactic productivity. In today's webinar, Antje will take us into the fascinating world of bilingual child language acquisition through the lens of code mixing. While mixing languages is often viewed negatively in public discourse, research tells a different story. Drawing on a usage-based approach, Antje will show us how code-mixed utterances are far from random or confused. They actually reveal the systematic building blocks children rely on as they develop increasingly productive linguistic knowledge, from fixed chunks to flexible patterns across languages. By combining insights from bilingualism research and usage-based linguistics, this session invites us to rethink code mixing as a meaningful and structured aspect of multilingual development rather than a sign of linguistic limitation. And now just one last thing before I hand over to Antje. For any questions or thoughts you'd like to share, please use the comment box. I'll gather them and forward them to Antje after the presentation. And now, Antje, thank you so much for putting a new light on code mixing. Vielen Dank in advance, und the screen is yours.
All right, so here we go. So welcome to our little session here, and actually the title already tells what we are sort of covering the next couple of minutes. Speaks to English. We are concerned with constructional patterns in child-bilingual code mixing. So before I go into code mixing and usage-based approach a little bit, let me start by sort of talking about a couple of myths, and there are tons of myths about bilingualism and multilingualism out in the world. And so, for example, people usually perceive bilingualism or multilingualism as a rare phenomenon. It's also very often assumed, or there is this myth about that bilinguals have basically equal proficiency and perfect knowledge of their languages. And a common concern concerning code mixing is that children sort of are confusing their languages and that they will never sort of acquire each language perfectly. So I'm going to refute all these myths and going to provide some evidence that this is actually not the case. So let me start with our first with our first myth. In general, as I've said, people always assume that bilingualism or multilingualism is something which is rare, but this is quite a monolingual perspective, and it's a monolingual bias that we also see in the literature as well as in research, because actually we do have more multilingual speakers in the world. So monolingualism is actually sort of the weird situation, and multilingual or bilingual speakers are actually the majority. So 2/3 of all children worldwide actually grow up in a multilingual environment. Yet theory and research, has a hard time catching up with these numbers actually. So let's talk about some definitions of multilingualism. Let's talk about some, common perceptions. So a normative definition of multilingualism that has been floating around in the literature for ages now is that a person is multilingual if the person is fluent in at least 2 languages. So this is what people often refer to as the maximal definition, but actually the reality is that we do not find a bilingual or multilingual speaker that has equal competence in all of his or her languages. From a functional or usage-based perspective, and that is the perspective I would like to propose in this little session here, is that linguistic competence or proficiency in 2 or more languages is actually linked to the language use. And most of us, I guess, speak more than 1 language here in this little webinar. So you all know that basically the languages are tied to different situations, domains, social roles, contexts. So it's never or hardly ever the case that you actually use both languages equally in both situations and say something first in language 1 and then you say the exact same content in language 2. So in the end, multilingualism is a continuum. When we talk about multilingualism, for some reason, and this is again the monolingual bias, we take multilingualism we take it for granted that multilingualism is interesting. But again, this is sort of the monolingual bias that we are exerting here. And in the end, multilingualism is actually not categorically different from any other lingualism. It's something which is both normal and something which is also quite special in one way, because what's the special thing about it is it's the widely shared belief or the need to actually keep languages separate and the cognitive naturalness of not actually doing this. And this brings me today's major topic. So we are concerned with child-bilingual code mixing. And code mixing is probably the most salient contact phenomenon when it comes to multilingualism. And I do have a couple of German-English examples here, which are actually taken from the Copra, which I will present in a minute. So these are children, Lily, Fian, and Sylvie. They are roughly between the age of 2 and 3. And when they are talking to their parents, they produce utterances like the following. So, I möchte Mama, no, a Wildschwein, du bist naughty, or cleanen the bath. When it comes to code mixing, it's basically also Pandora's box, just as all these definitions of multilingualism and or bilingualism are Pandora's box. The same is for concerning approaches to code mixing. So we have a long history of different perspectives and different disciplines trying to analyze code mixing. So structural approaches, they try to prioritize grammatical rules in the sense that they tell or they try to predict where in a sentence or an utterance a mix is possible and where a mix is not possible. Social-pragmatic approaches, they focus on the social motivations and conversational functions of code mixing. Psycholinguistic approaches, they were more interested in, are both languages activated, or do we have a language-specific activation? How do these languages, or how are these languages exist? And finally, the perspective I would like to propose, cognitive usage-based approaches. They view language structure as emerging from language use. So children, in the end, basically in a piecemeal way, acquire languages, relying on cognitive abilities, which are part of every cognition. So when it comes to different approaches to contact phenomena, as I've already indicated, we do have several approaches, but within linguistics, we sort of have these two camps in a way. We have structuralist, formalist approaches, which prioritize rules, stating which kind of phenomena are possible, where in a sentence or utterance a mix is possible. So basically coming up with syntactic constraints on how languages can be combined in multilingual speech. From a usage-based perspective, this is not so much an issue. So it's not about where in a sentence something is mixed, or if something cannot be mixed or is allowed in the utterance. We're mainly concerned, or mostly concerned actually, with how language or how cognitive factors and social factors influence language choice and the combination of languages within a sentence. So language is an inventory of units in the speaker's memory. We do not operate with lexicon and grammar. More or less, we actually perceive this as a continuum, and speakers constantly move along the continuum of lexicon and syntax. In recent years, we have actually seen a growing interest in usage-based approaches to multilingualism, language contact phenomena, and other subfields. This can be seen also in the number of publications and other researchers interested in the usage-based approach. And the overarching assumption across all these different subdisciplines is that language knowledge is inherently tied to knowledge of actual language use. So it's actually a what you see is what you get model. So language competence and language proficiency are simply the same, and language use is actually the generalization over usage events. As I've said, the usage-based approach actually relies on cognitive mechanisms that are part of every cognitive system. So humans are really, really good, for example, at tracking patterns. We're really good at frequency trackings. And the seemingly chaotic input that, for example, children receive is in the end quite structured, because we use a lot of repetition actually in what we are saying. So we use a lot of chunks, we use a lot of frame and slot patterns, we prime each other, and the basic cognitive mechanisms are analogy, categorization, cognitive mechanisms which are important for every kind of learning and not just for learning languages. So in the usage-based approach, we have a continuum between lexicon and grammar. So these are not distinct categories, but we actually blur the line between, because functional parts are very often, or functional elements are very often part actually of chunks and frame and slot patterns. So from a usage-based perspective, just coming back to language acquisition, and then we take a look at more code mixing examples. As I've said, we are quite repetitive, and we are even more so repetitive in the language we address to children. So we have quite a lot of frame and slot patterns that we use again and again. We have shorter utterances, we have a higher pitch, and children are quite capable, and they're quite proficient in extracting linguistic knowledge from the input they receive. So in a piecemeal way, they gradually build up their language, they gradually build up their complexity. And in the end, it's a general notion of humans that we are really good at finding patterns and regularities, not just in language, but the mapping and the analogical extension. That is something that we do on a daily basis. So the overarching research question for the remainder of the talk is related, as I've said, to the piecemeal acquisition. So language acquisition and language use is strongly item-based. And what we wanted to know in our project and in all the studies that we've done so far, we wanted to know whether children actually construct their code mixed utterances based on formulaic sequences and lexically fixed patterns. So do children basically use the bits and pieces that they acquire in their individual languages, and do they recycle these bits and pieces and reuse them in code mixed utterances? So this is a very different perspective from rule-based approaches, and taking individual differences into account, taking input situations into account, and other factors. Before we take a look at some more data and some more examples, let me briefly introduce the database that we've been using. So when I was still at the MPI, we were collecting, or we tried to find bilingual children, and we actually were able to find 3 German-English bilingual families that were willing to record their children several hours per week. So each of these children, Fionn, Sylvie, and Lily, they each have an English-speaking parent and a German-speaking parent. They all live actually in Germany, so the societal language is German. And all of these children grow up in a one-parent, one-language household, which is where basically each parent sticks to his or her native language. These are the commonalities between these 3 children, as you can see in the language output. So the children, they were recorded between the ages of 2 and roughly or close to 4 years of age. So this is quite a challenge to actually keep the families sort of motivated, that they record their children like 3 to 5 hours per week, doing, playtime, dinner time, bed routines when they bring the kid to bed, or other routines. And all of the data have been transcribed. And in the end, we have roughly sort of 50,000 utterances of Fionn and 180,000 utterances of the parents. And then you can see the numbers for Sylvie and Lily. So as I've said, all of these children are German-English bilingual. All of these children have an English and German-speaking parent, but you can see that the output of these children is quite different. Fionn is an interesting case because he grew up with an English-speaking father and a German-speaking mother. Initially, Fionn was quite German dominant, which can be seen by the darker blue proportions in the earlier months of his recordings. And this was something that, in a way, dissatisfied the parents a little bit, because English was sort of the weaker language, as if we would use traditional terms. And then the parents started to increase the input situation, which meant they went to the English-speaking country of the father, the grandparents, the English-speaking grandparents had to come over, other English-speaking interlocutors had to come over. And then we see that Fionn basically, after the age of 3 years and 3 months roughly, he starts to tip towards using more English actually in his environment. Sylvie, on the other hand, is another interesting case because it's an English-speaking mother, German-speaking father, but the father doesn't speak any English at all. However, Sylvie's mom is very fluent in German, and whenever the father and the mother speak with each other, they use obviously German. So Sylvie hears her mother's using German. She just knows her mother understands German. So whenever the mother addresses Sylvie, Sylvie just constantly, in a way, replies using German. Lily, on the other hand, again, has an English-speaking mother, German-speaking father, but both parents actually speak each other's language equally well. So whenever they are talking to each other, each parent just uses his or her language. So Lily has, in a way, I don't want to call it a balanced input because that's not the situation, but she has a sort of more input in terms of English. All right, so let's take a look at utterance length, because one of the myths which I presented earlier stated that bilinguals have equal proficiency or in both languages. And if we take a look at utterance length, actually, we see that this is not the case. If you focus on the green line first, we see that Sylvie, our German dominant child, has sort of a lower proficiency, shorter utterances in English, and more advanced, more complex utterances actually in German. For Lily, which is sort of more or less the balanced child, we see that both English and German are sort of more closer to each other, but still sometimes we have English, which is a bit stronger, sometimes we have German, but overall we still see differences. And if you remember the last child, Fion, he's the one who experienced this input shift. We see that German actually develops much faster and that he has longer and more complex utterances in German. But as you can see, English, the green line, is pretty much picking up soon after the age of 3. And then we have a roughly similar proficiency between these languages with ups and downs. But in the end, we see also that his input shift also features in the complexity of his utterances. Now, I didn't say anything about the red line because this is actually the most interesting line, because these are the utterance length for all the code mixed utterances that children produced. And as you can see, mixing is always more complex and always longer than the monolingual utterances. And also with age, they become longer and more complex. So we also have a development in the code mixed utterances here. So by just taking a look at this detailed utterance length analysis, and we also completed a complexity utterance analysis looking at whether utterances are more of a fragment or if they have sentence-like status. We also see that we have more fragments in the monolingual utterances and more sentence-like utterances actually in the code mix utterances. So what this little basically analysis shows is that bilinguals do not have equal and perfect knowledge of their languages, but actually balanced bilingualism is something that we hardly find because, as I've said in the beginning, languages are usually tied to interlocutors, context, situation, and that is different for every speaker. And we've already seen the differences between these 3 children, which all grew up in Germany, all have an English and German speaking parent, but still their development is very different from each other. So the subtle differences in their input situation is actually also reflected in their output. And what we can say for the code mixed utterances, since they are longer and more complex, it seems as if code mixing is a communicative advantage in a way, especially in these families where the parents more or less always use a so-called move-on strategy. So they do not flag or mark the code mixed utterances by the child, but they just continue with their conversation, plus they understand usually the code mix. So let's take a look at some more code mixing utterances, and let's take a look at the role of patterns. And these are all examples from the 3 bilingual children. So all of these produced code mixing throughout the recordings. And what we typically see in bilingual children, and especially in children that grow up with a one parent, one language approach, we usually see that roughly around the age of 4 or 5, code mixing starts to fade out, which is a natural outcome of the language distribution, because first of all, each parent uses his or her language. The parents hardly produce any code mixing. So what the children are doing, they are just tuning into the community conventions by actually keeping these languages separate. Plus, as soon as they're going to kindergarten or school, this is a more or less monolingual German environment in our case. So talking about patterns in code mixing, the question, of course, arises, how can we actually account for patterns? And especially the usage-based approach is a completely data-driven approach. It's a completely bottom-up approach in the end, where we try to find commonalities in the data. So we are looking at what can the data tell us instead of sort of imposing certain rules or regularities and then checking whether the data can confirm or basically is a violation to certain rules. So we use completely bottom-up data-driven approaches, and we have a lot of development in the usage-based paradigm concerning different approaches. The most important and probably one of the first is the so-called traceback method, and it's again in the name, where the traceback method, I'll talk about the traceback method in a minute, where basically the aim is to take an utterance, look at the bits and pieces in that utterance and try to trace it back to earlier occurrences and earlier utterances of the child, trying to find whether we have a complete match of an utterance or whether bits and pieces of that utterance have been uttered before. Chunk-based learner and also the dynamic network models, they work with transitional probabilities. In the case of the chunk-based learner, they work with backward transitional probabilities. In the case of the dynamic network model, it works with forward transitional probabilities. And these transitional probabilities basically tell us how likely is that one word is either preceded by a specific word or followed by a specific word. And if, for example, certain words constantly co-occur, they have the potential of forming, for example, a chunk, as in the case of chunk-based learner. And then finally, we have a frequency filter, which works with over and underrepresentation of frequencies. So let's take a look at the traceback, and I'm going to give a very sort of brief introduction to the method. So it's much more detailed, but I'm pretty sure that you sort of get the gist of the method. So if we have, for example, an utterance like und dann magic air and then magic air, which is a code mix by one of the children, what we are trying to do is we try to trace the code mix back to earlier utterances in the recordings. So at first we try to use the whole utterance to see if, for example, Fion uttered this code mix before. If he did not say und dann magic air before this specific instance, we take individual pieces of the utterance. So we actually see that Fion uses und dann several times in his monolingual utterances, and we actually also see that he has another code mix where he uses und dann some marmite. So we can say that und dann is probably sort of a fixed element in his repertoire, and he uses this chunk or this frame in order to create more productive utterances. So he has und dann, and then he has an open slot that he fills creatively, sometimes with other material or with material from the other language. So in the end, when we take a look at code mixing, we can basically identify chunks, which means we have the exact repetition of that code mix in earlier recordings, like und this is a very frequent bilingual chunk that, for example, Fion uses many, many times in his recordings. So he constantly goes und this, und this. We also sometimes see that children combine chunks, so fixed lexical material such as das hat, and then we have timeout, which is a frozen element in the repertoire of the child as well. And then we see that we have a lot of so-called partially schematic or frame and slot patterns, such as I have X, and then in the case of the code mix, Fion actually combines this with I have a big fever, which is fever. So he uses a frame and slot pattern I have, and then he puts in a big fever. So let's take a look at some results here, and I'm going to walk you through the plot. So we have Sylvie, Lily, and Fionn, and these are all the results, or these are the results concerning all the code mixed utterances. And as we can see, we try to identify patterns at 3 different times: at the age of 2, 3, at the age of 3 years, and at the age of 3, 9, or in the case of Lily and Fionn, 3, 10, and 3, 11, so close to 4 years of age. And it's not so much about the details, but what you see is you see a lot of light blue, which in our case means that a lot of code mixed utterances in these children are actually constructed around a frame and slot pattern or a partially schematic chunk. So children say things like "I can," and then we have actually the open slot, which is in the first example filled with the German Bezahl. And then we actually have another chunk with it, which is also a chunk in the speech of one of the children. The same goes for the other examples, ich bin, and then we have die Cat, which is actually a mixed noun phrase in this case. And interestingly, also the child kept the correct gender. And this is something that we find in all 3 children, that a lot of code mixing is actually constructed around frame and slot patterns, where the child has a chunk, a fixed element, and then the open slot is filled with material from the other language. Now, remember that all children are German-English bilingual, but still they have slight differences in their input situation. And this is something that we also see when we take a look at the language of the frames, so the language of the fixed element in these code mixed utterances. And Sylvie, she was our German dominant child. So she mainly constructs code mixing around a German frame, and then she puts in some English material, for example. So she produces things like ich habe auch, and then she puts in eine Rocket. Or she says things like ich will auch, and then she inserts painting, where the ich will auch, I want to, is a fixed element because she uses this frame many, many times in other parts of her speech, in her German speech mainly. For Lily, we again see that the language of the frames is more or less distributed between the languages, plus we have a couple of mixed frames, such as I bin. So we again see the different input situation for Lily. But the most interesting example again is Fionn, because remember, he experienced this input shift after the age of 3. And we see this shift also in how he constructs his code mixed utterances, because initially he constructs his code mixing around German frames, and then he puts material from the other language in the open slot. But then towards the end of the recordings, we see that his code mixing actually shifts to English frames, and then the open slot is filled with German material. So he then starts to produce things like I can, and then puts the German verb in there. So this is quite interesting if we look actually at, first of all, how children construct their code mixed utterances, plus how, which languages the frames are taken from. And we see a clear input-output correlation in these children's code mixing. So far, I just talked about German English, but we did this also with Polish English and Finnish English bilingual children, as well as with French Russian bilingual children. And we found concerning utterance length as well as code mixing nature, we found similar results. So no matter which languages the children are growing up, most of the time code mixing is constructed around a fixed element, and then the open slot is filled with material from the other language. So what we can say is most code mixed utterances can be attributed to linguistic patterns. The interesting thing is is that the patterns children use in their code mixing can also be found in the speech of the parents. So frequent frames in the parental speech are also the frames that children first of all use in the monolingual utterances, and they also find their way into the code mixed utterances. So frame and slot patterns play a very important role in how children actually construct their languages. So briefly just touching upon the chunk-based learner, which is again a different methodology to account for the pattern-based nature of language input as well as output. As I've said, the chunk-based learner works with backward transitional probabilities. I'm not going to go into much detail concerning the methodology, but as the name says, words that co-occur very frequently together have basically the potential to be a chunk in the inventory of the speech. And we applied the chunk-based learner to Fion's data as well as to Sylvie's data, but I'm just going to show you Fion's results. And we identified chunks in his monolingual speech. And then we also accounted for whether chunks play a role in his code mixing. And no surprise, if we take a look at the yellow utterances or parts of utterances, we actually see that if we have a code mix that is 2 words plus or 3 words plus, so in terms of length, we see that Fion uses the same chunks. For example, ich will, I want, ich will not, ich will nicht, I don't want. And these chunks are also very frequent in his monolingual utterances. So he just recycles basically the chunks from his monolingual utterances and uses these chunks also in his code mixing. So much for sort of some methodology issues and methodological approaches. Now, I want to finish with a very specific type of code mixing, because this is always then another question that we receive that, okay, I get this with the chunks and the frame and slot patterns, but how about morphological code mixing? And with morphological code mixing, I mean mixing within a single word. So whatever is in bold is actually the word internal or morphological mix. So the first example is milk, and then the child actually attached a German infinitive marker. We also see in the second example, second person singular marker, a German one, which is attached to sleep. So just note that we have here agreement. Ich sleepe bei dir. But we also see that, for example, progressive marker is attached to a German verb. When it comes to word formation, we also see a couple of compounds. We also see derivations. We have rare instances of blending, where, for example, the child says mooned instead of moon or mooned. We have another example here with Scheik, which is show and zeig. And then we have tons of compounding here, which goes into both directions, such as Polizei car, but also police Frau. So when it comes to morphological code mixing, we differentiate more or less in traditional terms between inflectional word formation processes, and the research questions that we wanted to ask is which types of word internal code mixing can be found in the 3 children's data? Do we see individual differences actually also between the code mixing? And do the children's input situation also give away what they do in their morphological code mixing? And of course, do we find recurring patterns in the code mixed words? So it's the same corpus, and I didn't say that earlier, but when you take a look at the grayish bar part, these are the mixed utterances. So when it comes to mixing, this is actually in these children a relatively low frequency phenomenon. And when it comes to the morphological code mixing, this is below 2% of all utterances. So it's a very infrequent phenomenon, but we still see a lot of patterns in the morphological code mixing. So what we did is we took all the code mixing of these children, and then we looked first of all for morphological code mixing, whether there is a morphological code mix. We then coded for if it's inflectional or if it's word formation. We coded for part of speech. We coded for function of the inflection and the language of the individual parts. As I've said, first of all, coming to results and coming to the frequency of morphological code mixing. Morphological code mixing is really infrequent. And that is now the advantage of having such a big corpus, because if in a large or a dense database, you do also catch these really, really infrequent phenomena. At first, we looked at the types of word internal code mixing, and as you can see, we have differences between the children, but also commonalities. So both children, more or less, all three children more or less use inflectional elements in their code mixing, and very often we have mixed compounds. So we have a mixed compound such as Mietzekat, which is kitty cat. We do have cherry kuchen, which is a cherry cake. We have the derivation here, wrinkelig, which is basically faltig, and so we take the derivational marker from German here. We do have the classic inflectional endings, such as the infinitive ending in look, where we have the German infinitive looken. But we also see, again, the other way around, a German stem, and then we have an English marker here with the ing. And as I've said, blendings are relatively infrequent, so just a couple of blendings. Since inflectional code mixing is one of the major types of morphological code mixing, let us first and briefly take a look at the languages in morphological code mixing. And what we see again is the language situation in these children. So Sylvie, again, this is our last bar. She is the German dominant child, and she mainly produces English stems, and then she attaches a German inflectional marker. Lily has sort of like a 2/3, 1/3 distribution. So she has mainly English stems, but there's also quite a substantial amount of German stems with an English inflectional marker. And a similar pattern for Fion, lots of English stems, and then towards the end, we actually have German stems. And for Fion, I just briefly want to go into the developmental picture again, because as I've said, he is the really interesting child with the input shift. And we see again this input shift also in his morphological code mixing concerning inflectional elements, because initially he mainly produces English stems and then a German inflectional marker. And then towards the end of the recordings, we actually see a shift where he produces German stems, such as bauen, and then he attaches an English inflectional marker. And this is quite interesting concerning, again, his input shift. I just briefly skipped the inflectional categories. As I've said, concerning mixed compounds, there is a tendency towards German modifiers and English heads, but we also see the other way around. But again, then compounding is more sort of the intermediate position in a way. So it's a lexical word formation process. So we do have a greater transparency in terms of compositionality here. Right. So coming to the end, when it comes to morphological code mixing, we do see that inflectional mixes and compound mixes dominate. We do see individual differences in terms of preference between these three children. And what is actually the most interesting thing is that even in the really infrequent situations of inflectional code mixing, such as attaching the infinitive to a German infinitive to an English stem, even there we see the input situation and the slight differences in the input situation in each child. And what we also see is, especially when it comes to inflectional code mixing, we see highly frequent patterns such as the infinitive marker or the progressive marker, and that children slot basically material from the other language into the open slot. So, what we have shown so far and what we see in all of the studies we've done so far is that code mixing can be accounted for by lexically fixed patterns and emerging frame and slot patterns. So children use the bits and pieces they have in their monolingual utterances, and they use these bits and pieces to create code mixing. So on the one hand, code mixing is something which is extremely creative, but on the other hand, the creativity relies on what the children have already acquired, and it just looks so creative because all of these children hardly hear any code mixing in their input, and they just sort of pool on their resources of the two languages. And as I've said, the parents are acceptable of code mixing, so it's just a very efficient way of taking material which is at the moment available. And what we also see is that very often parts of these code mix utterances have been uttered before, so the individual bits and pieces, and then children just use these because it's in the end, the cognitive system is lazy, the cognitive system is slow, and speakers just select whatever is more available to them, and so the activation is determined by input and previous usage. And we have seen that with the traceback, but we've also seen that in priming studies where we specifically looked at whether parts of the code mix had been uttered a couple of utterances before. And this is what we see in the data, that very often a frame or the open slot has been uttered before, and then children just take this. What is mostly important is that we shouldn't look at code mixing as something which is deficient or as something that is rule governed, or that we should sort of try to impose certain regularities on. Code mixing is a dynamic process, and it's not a one-fit-all grammar that can be applied here, but it's something which is different in each child, something which is determined by their input situations. It's determined by their piecemeal acquisition and contextual and interlocutor factors and cognitive factors in the end. All right. This was basically all I had to say for now. I want you to sort of, I want to advertise a little bit our corpus, because this is what we're doing at the moment in our project. We make these 3 corpora available for the community. So if you're interested in working with highly dense German-English bilingual corpora, you can go to the Child-Bilingual Talk Bank, and then you'll find the Child-Bilingual English-German MPE EFA Leipzig corpus there. And these are my colleagues with whom I'm working in the project. And as I've said, we try to basically make the data available so that the community can work with German-English bilingual data. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very, very interesting presentation. I don't see questions actually coming up from the audience right now, but if there's anything that comes up later, great. In the meanwhile, I have a question which is more related to personal experience as a parent of bilingual children. And I remember when my children were young, there was actually this very negative idea of they won't learn both languages properly. And so I actually was very worried, even though I knew that it was a very good thing for them to learn both German and Italian at the same time, and that they would never be proficient never it was unlikely that they would be marvelously well speakers of both languages. But what can one answer to parents who have this concern about the child mixing up languages? Because I mean, from your research, it basically shows that it's a very, very common thing,
Yeah,
but also a very creative thing, isn't it? I mean, it's positive
it
apart
is.
from fun.
Right. So it is something which is really creative. And what we usually tell parents is, first of all, native input is important. So native speakers, because we also very often get other kinds of questions. So I'm very good at English. Should I or should I not? Well, in the end, it's personal. It's a personal decision. But if you have native input in both languages, this is something which is sort of an important factor. The other issue concerning, parental concerns, this is again very often mediated by, societal issues and the monolingual bias that we have on bilingualism, because we always take the monolinguals as sort of the ultimate speaker and the perfect speaker, and the bilinguals, they basically have to be measured against the monolingual speaker. But in the end, this is not fair, because first of all, it's bilinguals that are actually the majority. So what we should do is we should actually compare the bilinguals to the bilingual children, right? And we need to sort of come up with measurements that compare sort of each group with each other, but not constantly comparing the monolinguals to the bilinguals or the bilinguals to the monolinguals, this way around. Concerning code mixing, in the end, it's just a very efficient strategy. It's an activation-driven strategy. It's an entrenchment. So structures which are highly entrenched, which have been used in the input, which have been recently used in the discourse situation, they just find their way into code mixing. And in the end, parents shouldn't do anything about it, because as we've seen in, there are different communities worldwide in terms of like how they employ or how they use their languages. And in the case of the one parent, one language approach, we have a natural sort of separation of the two languages. So children will just tune in this community convention. And they know from early on that, for example, if they're in kindergarten, the kindergarten teacher will not speak sort of one of the languages, right? Because usually kindergarten and schooling and education is in one language. So they know from the beginning, they know like which languages to associate with which speaker. And for them, it's actually not about languages. It's just sort of like, it's the same, like, that you can use a dialect in a certain situation, when you're with, I don't know, relatives, or when you're in your hometown. This is where you use your dialect. And then as soon as you're in a more official situation, you just sort of move to the more standard pronunciation and usage. And it's nothing different in bilinguals. That's why we say bilingualism is just as common as any other form of lingualism. It's nothing special.
And that brings me also to my second question, because I know that you said it during the presentation. You said like by the age of 4 or 5, they stop. One stops code mixing. First of all, is this only because of the societal background, then, or only because, as you said right now, because they feel that something is not that correct, and therefore it's better to use just the one language, and they have the competence, they have acquired the competence? And secondly, what if they don't stop because just again too much personal information? My 19-year-old, very proficient speaker of Italian, still code mixes stuff.
Yeah, because and I would assume he does this in situations where both languages are understood.
Yeah, obviously he does it at home. Yeah, true.
Right.
That's
So
true.
he doesn't do he just, I mean, that's the same situation, like It's like at work, for example. I know everybody speaks English, so whenever we talk about work-related stuff, it's a lot of code mixing because we just know the other person speaks both languages, and we're just lazy again. We just
Yeah.
whatever is activated first is used in these conversations. But as soon as you actually hit or meet a situation where where only one language is understood, you will take a great effort actually to stay in your monolingual mode, as we would say. And there are communities also, like if you go to the US, where we have lots of Hispanic communities, code mixing is their communicative code. So that's why code mixing will also be persistent when they are adults, because it is part of their identity, it's part of their community. So the community convention is code mixing, but as soon as they are outside their community, they will not do this. So it's just a tuning in into the community conventions.
Yeah, and the right register to choose when.
Exactly. It's like with everyday life, right? So you just sort of adapt to the situation.
It's just
and
that
then
sometimes it's really you just like when it's when it's a young adult in your own family who has the it just is it's still funny. Let's put it this way, even though it's still creative also, because it's a way to ease in his way. And
exactly.
It's just laziness, as you said before.
Yeah, the system is slow. The system is
energy.
lazy. And the system always wants to be as economic as possible. And this is just one way. We just take, as I said, the highly entrenched and highly activated bits and pieces. And,
Yeah. And my last question, because I think it was very interesting to know that we see more inflectional mixing than derivational mixing, but is there a reason for it, or is there an explanation why? Or is this more complicated? Would this be more complicated, the derivational?
Yeah, so in the end, derivational sort of morphology is less schematic, as we would say, as inflectional morphology. So it's actually more lexically entrenched. So derivations are more lexically entrenched. So therefore, they're entrenched as a whole chunk and not so much sort of open for an open slot into which we can insert certain items. Whereas when we have inflectional stuff, so like the infinitive or all the agreements that we have in German when it comes to verbs, for example, these are in the end just frame and slot patterns. So we have the X, which is our open slot, and then we have the ending that is required. And therefore, this is much more sort of schematic in terms of frames and slot patterns, and therefore more inviting to produce code mixing and inflectional situations in comparison to derivation, which are much more lexically entrenched in the end.
Okay, great. And we also have a question from the audience. The question is, I have 2 children. The elder 8 speaks English and German. The other 5 only speaks German. For the second one, what could be the better approach to teach him English without stress?
Increasing the situations where the child has to use English. So this is similar to what Fion actually, to the situation of Fion. He was also the younger brother, so he has actually an older brother who is also German English bilingual. The father was the English speaker, the mother was the German speaker. We have the societal language German, which is a huge impact. So we have a classic minority situation actually of English. And what the parents basically really did is they increased the number of speakers of English. So they increased, frequency of English. And since the brother is also, so the older brother, he also used a lot of German then sometimes at home, but sometimes also English. And then, what really made the tipping point in Fion's case was a very long stay then in the father's home country, where English was required, which was the community language, and then the grandparents and other family members who were English monolingual, they came over to Germany. So we have an increase in frequency and an increase in speakers, because this is also always beneficial in terms of acquisition if you hear language from more than one speaker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if the other speaker really doesn't understand you when you speak in German.
Right.
Great. So there are no other questions coming up. Thank you.
Thank you.
From no, there's also the thank you for your answer to the audience. And yeah, I would say we can say goodbye, can't we? Thank you again for this very, very interesting talk, and yeah, thank you for having participated.
Thank you very much for inviting me.